Hello. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our 10th episode of Data Talks, a series of free 45-minute webinars about using local data to inform housing policy. My name is Claudia Aiken. I am Director of New Research Partnerships here at the Housing Solutions Lab. This episode will explore the data and evidence around work requirements and time limits in the context of housing assistance in order to better understand the implications of new federal proposals to implement these policies across public housing and housing voucher programs. I am delighted to be co-presenting with my colleague Ellie, who is a doctoral fellow here at the Furman Center. We are also very excited to have with us today Nicole Beydler, Director of Policy and Communications at the Housing Authority of the County of San Bernardino, which did implement a time-limited housing voucher program beginning in 2012. And Will Fischer, Senior Fellow and Director of Housing Policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, which has been closely tracking and analyzing the federal policy proposals on this topic. I will start things off with a very brief introduction to the lab and this series. Ellie and I will then dive into a short presentation about what we've learned about work requirements and time limits. Then we'll have a conversation with Nicole and Will to learn more about what is happening at the federal level and what implementation and evaluation of a time limit looks like on the ground. And finally, we will have about 10 to 15 minutes for your questions. So please feel free to submit those via the Q&A function at any time during the session, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So if you're not familiar with the lab, we are based at the NYU Furman Center. Our mission is to help especially small and mid-sized cities plan, launch, and evaluate housing policies with the goals of advancing racial equity, health, and well-being. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you'll also take the opportunity to check out past episodes on our website, as well as register for upcoming ones. We're going to have one later this month as part of Climate Week. Each of these sessions features a fireside chat with someone like Nicole or Will who has first-hand experience about the topic. We also like to post recommended reading as well. So we'll drop the link for where you can see all that in the chat. As I mentioned at the top, today's episode focuses on two policy priorities of the Trump administration: work requirements and time limits in federal rental assistance. Earlier in the year, when these priorities were really emerging, we heard from housing authorities that they were very eager to know what evidence and data exists around these topics so that they could better prepare for what may be coming down the pike. Ellie and I did a two-part analysis. The first part trying to understand which housing authorities have ever tried or considered these policies and what we can really learn from their experience. The second part, analyzing HUD data to understand who might be affected by these kinds of policies. We are going to share some highlights from that research today. We really want to devote the bulk of our time, though, to our guests and to your questions. So I would just encourage you, if you do want to know more, to read the full brief, and you can scan the QR code here. We'll also, there it is, drop another link in the chat. So first, what do we know about work requirements? We started off by trying to identify PHAs that have ever tried this. It's important for a little context to note that of the more than 3,000 PHAs across the country, only a relatively small subset called moving to work agencies, there are about 140 of them, have the flexibility currently to do something like work requirements or time limits. So based on a HUD report from 2022, as well as a scan of plans that these moving to work agencies have to submit to HUD, we identified 16 that have ever tried or considered a work requirement. This list is probably not exhaustive. We may be missing some, but of those that we captured, most of them have their policies still in place. 3 have closed theirs out, and another 3 have not yet implemented their proposal. Among the 16, we see some variation in terms of the number of hours required, also who exactly is subject to the requirement. I think importantly, while some agencies apply the work requirement kind of broadly to all work-able adults in their public housing or voucher portfolio, many of them implemented them as part of a targeted or even voluntary program, or even only to certain public housing buildings or sites. We also found that many agencies kind of built this series of warnings and supports before a non-compliant household would face a sanction. And sanctions included things like the PHA lowering their subsidy temporarily, requiring them to attend some kind of check-in or class or counseling, or ultimately, of course, terminating the subsidy. Um, Based on the HUD report, we know that compliance rates for agencies that report this are generally high, between 72 and 96%. Most agencies really only report ever terminating a handful of households. And that's because they offer hardship exemptions and really try to work with non-compliant households to help them attain employment and meet the requirement. Also, notably, often this requirement is part of a package of things meant to help a specific cohort of households gain income. Things like case management, counseling, rent reform, even financial incentives. PHAs have reported that compliance monitoring and tracking requires time, that households can be worried about losing other benefits if they increase their hours. Um, things like SNAP or Medicaid, and that they also face lots of barriers to employment, transportation, childcare, past criminal conviction, even employers that are purposefully keeping their hours low enough to avoid having to provide insurance. I won't spend much time here, but we did also scan the literature and found that there's just not a lot of evidence from the housing assistance space specifically on whether work requirements are effective. The only causal evaluation that we have is for the requirement in Charlotte, North Carolina, which combines a 20-hour per week requirement with some supportive services. And the researchers there found that the policy was associated with a modest increase in employment. But while there's little evidence from the housing space, there's a ton of evidence from other large social safety net programs, including SNAP, Medicaid, TANF. Again, without going into much detail here, I would say the preponderance of the evidence is that work requirements don't seem to be very effective when they're implemented at this large scale level without supportive services. They drastically reduce program participation, the research shows, without actually increasing employment. And in fact, the large majority of people subject to the requirements are already working. So it's that extra burden of having to prove that they're working that causes them to lose out on assistance. We did the same kind of analysis for time limits. This time, we identified 19 agencies that have ever tried or proposed a time-limited subsidy. Of those, 11 have since closed out their time limits. Among the 19, we also generally see a time limit that is around 5 years, often with the possibility of a 2-year extension. So that stands in some contrast to the shorter limits that have been proposed and that we'll hear about. The time limits usually apply only to work-able households. And again, while in some cases they're kind of applied broadly across the entire voucher program at a given housing authority or in the entire public housing program. In many cases, again, they're targeted to certain buildings or households that are seen as particularly work-ready and are participating in a certain program or track that's meant to help them gain economic independence. Interestingly, I would say, of the 11 agencies that have dropped their time limits, 5 did so before the time limit ever went into effect. And so before it would have exited the first households. The reasons that PHAs cite for ending their time limits do vary. In some cases, they've said that rents went up so quickly, or there was some shock like the pandemic that made it suddenly really hard to get a job. And so they were just concerned that they would be exiting these households into an unsustainable situation. Others found the time limits hard to administer. We'll hear from Nicole about what it takes to do this well. There's monitoring, there's exemptions, there's turnover associated with these policies. But that said, a few time limits have stood the test of time, and San Bernardino's program is obviously one of those. And lastly, in terms of the evidence, again, it's fairly limited. San Bernardino is studying its program in partnership with Loma Linda University, and we're excited to hear about that. Otherwise, we're relying mainly on the Family Options Study, which didn't actually look at a time limit, but did directly compare vouchers with shorter term assistance and mainly looking at homelessness outcomes. That study found that vouchers were associated with the lowest incidence of homelessness long-term compared with these shorter-term interventions, but also slightly lower employment and earnings. So with that, I'm now going to turn it over to Ellie to talk us through her analysis of the HUD data.
Great, thank you, Claudia. So in addition to our scan of the PHA policies and the existing literature, we also turn to the administrative data to determine some estimates of who might be affected by the proposed work requirements and time limits. Next slide. And so our goal with this analysis was to estimate how many households have work-able members and how long those households have been assisted in these programs to start to understand sort of the scale of how many households would be impacted by these proposals sort of as they've been suggested. And so we looked at both the Section 8 and the public housing programs and report some results separately. But the analysis used household level programmatic action data from forms 50058, 5059, and the MTW data nationwide. But a lot of these analysis steps that I'll talk through could be replicated for your individual PHA using your own administrative data as well. So our first step was to identify which households could be considered work able. Like Claudia mentioned, these are the households who would likely be subject to work requirements and to time limits. And so within the data, we identified a household as work able if the household head, co-head, or spouse was aged 18 to 61 and not disabled, or if there were other working age adults in the household and the household was earning wage income. Households were considered not work able if there is no working age non-disabled adult in the household. And then there was a small group of households with sort of this unclear status where, given our available data fields, we couldn't categorize them confidently. But this is a very small share. So this is how we did these definitions for this report. I think once we have more information about who might these requirements apply to, the data could be used to kind of reformat these definitions as well. So taking a look at the nationwide averages, we see that 43% of Section 8 households and 49% of public housing households included a work-able member. And these are the groups that would potentially be subject to these new work requirements and time limits. And then next slide, breaking down that work-able group, we can see that over half of work-able households already earned wage income in 2024. So that suggests that many work-able households could already be in compliance with new work requirements, but it is possible that, new rules might require more hours or more months of the year of work than households are currently working. And they would also have to start reporting work hours. So households could still risk losing their assistance due to reporting administrative burdens, sort of even if they are working, which I think came up in our scan as well. The work requirements would also newly affect work-able households who do not currently earn wage income. That's that darker blue bar, and that's about 1/5 of households in each program. Another finding that we highlight in the brief is that the share of households with work-able adults is considerably higher for households with children compared to households without children. So you can see the red bars are showing that in 2024, about 38% of households with children included work-able adults, but did not have wage income, and so could potentially be affected by new work requirements, depending on how they're configured. And in general, the vast majority of households with children can be categorized as work-able and could be affected by these policies. So turning to time limits, we know that the time limits would likely only apply to work-able households, and the share of affected households would vary on the length of the time limit imposed, whether the clock would have already started or not. But to start to understand who could be affected by a potential 2-year time limit, we first looked at the share of work-able households who were still assisted at the end of 2024, who had been receiving assistance for longer than 2 years. And so of those work-able, 69% of Section 8 households and 71% of public housing households had been in the program for longer than 2 years. So a 2-year time limit on current households could be potentially incredibly disruptive for households and for PHAs. But because, and you can advance the slide, because the currently assisted population has not been subject to a time limit to date, there are lots of these longer term recipients, which makes that share on the last slide larger. But we also wanted to understand in general, for each sort of entering cohort of new assisted households, how many continue to receive assistance for 2 years or longer. And that can help understand how the effects of time limits might look for sort of future entering households after the current group were to potentially lose assistance if the time limit goes into effect. So to answer this question, we looked at the cohort of households who either started receiving Section 8 subsidies or moved into public housing in 2022 and were work able at the time of entry. And we then measured the share of those who were still work able and still in the program 24 months later. We also looked at households who entered in 2019 and 2014 to determine what percentage of entering households would be affected by 5 or 10-year time limits as well. So of work-able households who started receiving assistance in 2022, so this is this group over on the left, 62% of Section 8 households and 57% of public housing households were still in the program and work-able 2 years after entry. About a third of work-able households who entered in 2019 and about a sixth of those who entered in 2014 were still assisted 5 and 10 years later. So this suggests that even time limits of more than 2 years would still affect a considerable share of households. So we'll stop our presentation here and we can just turn to discussion and questions. And if you're interested in more detail about the analysis, you're also welcome to read the full brief on the Housing Solutions Lab website. But I will turn this back to Claudia.
Thanks so much, Ellie. All right, so let's move into our discussion now. Will and Nicole, thank you so much for being here. Nicole, if it's okay, I want to start by talking a bit about what a time limit policy really looks like on the ground. San Bernardino has operated the term limited leased assistance program, which gives a 5-year voucher to non-elderly, non-disabled households. And you've been doing that since 2012. Could you tell us just a bit more about the program, how it works, and what motivated the Housing Authority to implement something like that?
Sure. Great question. Thanks for having us, Claudia. So I want to start with the question about what was the motivation behind adopting a term limit, because that's probably the number one question that we get asked is, if it's voluntary, why would you ever do this? So really, it was a desire to serve the households who are on our wait lists. We have a huge number of customers on our waiting list. Even right now, we're approaching near 200,000, which is kind of a record for the Housing Authority of the County of San Bernardino. We've never had this many customers, but it comes from the fact that housing authorities have extremely limited resources. And unlike many other social safety nets, we aren't funded to assist every household who is eligible for our services. Rather, we essentially get a fixed amount of funding, a fixed amount of vouchers, and we serve as many households as we can with those vouchers and that funding. But we can't assist new households from our waiting list until a currently assisted family leaves our program, and then we can turn over that voucher and assist a new customer from our waiting list. So a lot of this came from our desire to serve those customers on our waiting list by reducing the amount of time that a career-able customer spend in our program. So essentially streamlining and speeding up the transition through our rental assistance program, our voucher program, to be able to serve new customers. So I think what I'd like to talk about, as you mentioned, it is limited to customers who are not elderly and not disabled. I did want to add, we adopted a local definition of elderly. We set that as age 57 or older. And we did that because we did not want households who would reach the age of 62 during that 5-year term limit to be subject to that term limit. So it's only for households who are younger than the age of 57 when they entered the program. We also limited, just in the structure of our program, we limited it to our our tenant-based voucher program, so not the project-based or public housing programs. And that's because the rental assistance in those other programs is tied to the unit, whereas customers in our tenant-based voucher program, the assistance is tied to the customer. And so with the project-based and public housing programs, when the term limit, when the housing subsidy reached its conclusion, the family would have to move. And we know that can be very disruptive, especially for a family who's on a trajectory towards self-sufficiency, to require them to relocate. We did not want to apply a term limit to those households. So tenant-based voucher customers can, if they opt to, remain in the same unit when that housing assistance concludes. I think that's another important element of the design. Kind of just the nuts and bolts of it. When customers are selected from our waiting list and they come in for what's known as a voucher briefing, that's when they get information about the 5-year term limit, all of our accompanying supportive services at the time when they receive their voucher. Aside from the term limit and the supportive services, the program functions very much like the rest of our rental assistance programs. Customers pay an income-based portion of their rent to the landlord. We pay the remainder as a subsidy on behalf of the household. They search for and lease a unit on the private rental market, just the same that they would in any other rental program. We do have a 2-year extension available. Customers who are pursuing a self-sufficiency activity can apply for and be eligible for up to 2 years of extended assistance. And I think I kind of mentioned it already that we have supportive services. So I think it's important to mention that when we adopted our term limits activity, we did not want just a cut and dry, this is a time limit on your rental assistance. We knew that customers in our programs, even as the data shows, we knew that customers in our programs, even our career-able customers, have barriers and challenges when it comes to leasing housing without rental assistance. So we wanted to pair those services, or rather the rental assistance, with coaching services to help them both identify, establish a plan, and then overcome those barriers through referral services with community partners. So we did establish, again, using our moving to work flexibility, we established a small dedicated team of self-sufficiency specialists who work just with our term limit customers from the time that they enter our rental assistance program, our term limit program. They meet with them at least annually for progress check-ins, for goal check-ins, to do those referral services. And again, we were able to do that through our moving to work designation because we had administrative savings from other kind of streamlining activities that we had previously implemented rather. And that team, I think it's important to stress that this is a very small team working with our customers in our term limit program. So I cannot stress enough how important it is that you have strong relationships with your community partners who can provide in-kind services to the customers in this program. So yeah, that's it, kind of a nutshell, a long nutshell, but nutshell.
I really appreciate that. And I'm going to ask you to put things in another nutshell. I'm sure, there's a spotlight being shined on you all right now because we're so hungry for evidence. And I'd love to know just, what have you all learned about implementing something like this over the last 10 plus years, in terms of both the outcomes for households and also implementation and best practices?
Sure. I'll start with outcomes because I think that's probably where everybody is hoping we'll get to. And then we can talk a little bit about policy and implementation and those pieces. But we have definitely seen a mix of both positive and negative outcomes. So I'll just give kind of some highlights from some of the statistical outcomes that I can share with you all. So families participating in our TLA program, we do see an average earned income increase of about 45%. Now, tempering that with, we're still talking about very low income families. So the average is changing from about 12,500 to about 18,600. So it's about a 45% increase, but we're still talking about low income households, but that's earned income exclusively. So that's not overall income. We do also see as customers participate in the program over time, their reliance on assistance income. So you mentioned things like Medicaid and SNAP, that tends to decrease. We tend to see it drop off about year 2. At the same time that earned income is actually increasing. So we see a shift in the income overall. And we do see that earned income tends to, the percentage of families who have a source of earned income does increase over time. It jumps from about 50 to about 60% by that 5th year of exit. So again, kind of correlation with unemployment decreasing as well. They do tend to participate with our supportive services team. They do tend to have about 3 interactions on average, again, recognizing that some customers don't stay through the full 5 years. So on average, about 3 years. And those goals that they set with our self-sufficiency team, they do tend to stay very engaged with those. So through our research, we did find that it shows a very active engagement in long-term planning with those in progress or completed goals. We also assess other areas like healthcare, legal involvement, life skills, mental health, childcare, et cetera, and those were scoring consistently high. Some of the challenges that we did see is about 20% of households in our program had not completed high school. So that was a significant barrier that we had identified when customers come in. And it's one reason why oftentimes one of the first goals for customers is to complete either a GED or a high school diploma so that they can move toward other self-sufficiency goals. And I think finally, I mentioned at the beginning, one of the main motivators was to be able to transition career-able customers through the program more rapidly. And we have seen a significant decrease in the amount of time that this population spends in the term limit program. It's dropped from an average of 8 years prior to term limits to about 4 years at this point. So keeping in mind that many customers do leave early for a variety of reasons. Some of them pursue home ownership and actually leave through success like that. Some of them reach an over income status where they're no longer eligible for the program. Others leave voluntarily. They just relinquish the assistance. We no longer need it. And frankly, that tends to kind of skew the data. What we see is the customers who stay for the full 5 years tend to need that assistance for the full 5 years. I can talk a little bit, if you like, about implementation and best practices and kind of
just a minute, I think would be great.
Sure, I'll go quick then. I think first and foremost, you got to know what your goals are when you're going into a term limits activity. What do you hope to achieve? So for us, it was transitioning those career-able customers through so we could serve more families from our waiting list. But we also wanted to provide families with an opportunity to receive those self-sufficiency supports and leave our program with more tools in their toolkit. So I think that was important in how we designed our program, knowing what we wanted. Second implementation advice I would give is be prepared to collect and evaluate a lot of data. The standard stuff you get through rental assistance, like the 50058, there we go, is kind of a starting point, but you're missing a lot of the picture unless you have some other information that you can collect to augment that. So if you can find a research partner to help you with that, that's your best bet.
Thanks, that's perfect. We love to talk about data in data talks. Let's zoom out a little bit now and talk about what is happening at the federal level. Will, I know that CBPP has been tracking federal proposals to place work requirements, time limits on housing assistance programs. Could you tell us a bit more about what you've seen proposed to date and any thoughts you might have on what's coming next?
Sure, and yeah, thanks for pulling this together and inviting me on. So yeah, like you said earlier, the imposing work requirements and time limits, both on housing assistance programs and also on other programs that help people meet basic needs, so like health insurance and food assistance as well. So imposing those kinds of requirements has been a top priority of the Trump administration. And to some degree also Republicans in Congress. And so we've seen currently on the housing assistance side, there's 3 tracks of proposals to either allow or require these kinds of policies. So the first was that the Trump administration, in the budget that they released last spring, included a proposal to require all rental assistance programs to include a 2-year time limit on rental assistance to any household that does not include a senior or a person with a disability. And that was part of a proposal that would also have cut funding for those programs by close to half and converted them all to a block grant that to be administered by states. And so far, this proposal has not gotten traction on the Hill. It has not moved forward legislatively, but there's every reason to expect that the Trump administration will continue to propose it and to seek to advance it going forward. The second is that there was a bill introduced by Senator Tim Scott, the Road to Housing bill that was introduced in the previous Congress that would have expanded MTW with no cap. And so this would have effectively sharply increased the number of housing agencies that have the option to impose work requirements and or time limits. And that bill has advanced. The Senate Banking Committee passed a version of this bill in July with with bipartisan support. But the version of the bill that advanced includes a much smaller MTW expansion, so 20 agencies. And it also narrows HUD's authority with respect to those agencies, and that includes specifically prohibiting the waivers that allow work requirements and time limits. And then the third, and on that, we don't know what the prospects are for it advancing those. So the proponents of the bill are seeking to move it forward, but it's unclear whether that's going to happen or not at this point. And then the third option, the third track, is that the administration has announced that it plans to propose a regulation that would allow housing agencies and also project-based rental assistance owners to impose work requirements and also the option to impose lifetime limits on receipt of housing assistance. And we don't know additional details of this, so the kind of announcement that this is in the works is just a paragraph long, and so it doesn't include more than that, but we could sort of at any time see a proposed regulation allowing these policies. But one important thing to note here is it's not clear that the administration has the authority to do this by regulation. So, and this is part of why there's been kind of longstanding efforts to provide legislative authority to allow these things through the Moving to Work demonstration. So like the housing statute, the U.S. Housing Act establishes eligibility criteria for rental assistance, and it does not include things like work requirements and time limits. So it's not clear that HUD can just go ahead and allow PHAs to do that. So the takeaway from that is that it's likely that when this regulation does get put forward, that so there would be a comment period, and HUD would have to process those comments, but there's also likely to be a legal challenge to its legality, and the outcome of that would be uncertain. But that all said, that seems like the most kind of likely version of this to move forward, just because it is regulatory. It's something that HUD can advance on its own, and so the time frame could be relatively quick for them to put something like that into effect and to face the legal challenges that it's going to face. And so that is something that could easily play out over the next 6 months to a year.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's really helpful context. You and your colleague, Eric Gartland, also recently released a report in which you estimated that placing time limits on federal rental assistance could affect more than 3 million people, more than half of them children. We are running out of time, so I would love to get into the details of that. But at Data Talks, we really try to think about how data can inform action at the local level. And so I want to ask you both, Will, given your analysis, and Nicole, you work with data a lot from your program. What advice might you have to give to housing authorities right now that are looking at this potentially coming down? What data should they be looking at? Are there other ways that they can be preparing? And maybe starting with you, Will.
Sure. So, I mean, so I think one thing, and it might have on this be different from Nicole's, but I mean, our recommendation would be that if these policies are provided as an option, not to adopt them, and we would say that for both work requirements and time limits. And as I was saying, like that seems like the most likely thing to move forward is an option for PHAs and project-based rental assistance owners to do this. And the reasons for that are one is kind of the data analysis that you discussed earlier, which suggests that these policies have little or no impact on rates of employment and work. When you looked at controlled evaluations that compare people who are subject to these policies to people who are not, and that's based on other programs where many, many more people have been subject to these requirements, including TANF, SNAP, and Medicaid. So there's little impact on employment. There's also they create large administrative burdens, and kind of the administrative burdens are larger the more things you do that are supports or trying to be responsive to people's needs and provides them the individualized kinds of responses that they need. And this is a time when housing agencies are pretty stretched in terms of administrative budgets. And so I think our sense would be that a priority would be things like maintaining public housing or helping people with rental assistance to find vouchers. And then the other thing is that I think that these policies, there's a lot of evidence of these policies doing harm to people. And I think part of that is that they've often been implemented without all the exemptions and exemptions and supports that Nicole was talking about in San Bernardino, but there's lots of evidence of many people, losing health insurance, losing SNAP benefits, losing cash assistance on TANF, and that leading to hardship for many people, and especially to many children. And then the other kind of harmful impact that I'd highlight is that there's lots of people who end up losing assistance under these policies who are folks who are supposed to either be exempt from them or who are covered by them but actually are working and meet the requirements. And the reason for that is that, or a reason for that is that the share of people that are work able but not working and not in some situation that clearly makes it difficult for them to work is pretty small. So like when we looked at the data, and this is similar data to what you all looked at, but so it's 91% of rental assistance recipients are either seniors, people with disabilities, currently work or worked within the last 2 years, or are caring for either a young child or a person with a disability. So that leaves 9% who are not in those categories. And for quite a few of those folks, there might also be a reason why they're unable to work, whether it's because they have a healthcare limitation that doesn't qualify as a disability, or because they're not able to find work, or they or they aren't able to find work consistently over time. So there's a large chunk of people who aren't supposed to lose their assistance, but there's a lot of room. But these kinds of policies often put reporting burdens on them to report hours or to demonstrate exemptions. So at a minimum, it's putting burdens on those folks in addition to putting burdens on agencies. But it also puts them at risk of losing assistance if there's a mistake either by the agency or by the household themselves of not understanding or doing all the paperwork that's needed. So there's a lot of risk that many of those 91% are going to lose assistance in addition to some of that 9%. And this is something that we've seen, for example, in Medicaid, states that have implemented work requirements under Medicaid waivers, that lots of people who should be eligible for exemptions still manage to lose health insurance, still do lose in health insurance, either because they make a mistake or the agency does. And then the last thing I'd highlight is that, whatever the arguments for these things in the past, I think it's even more going to be even more challenging and more potentially harmful going forward, because in the Republican bill that they passed earlier this year, they greatly expanded work requirements under both SNAP and Medicaid. So policies that cut off assistance to people with rental assistance are also going to be happening at the same time that those folks are losing health insurance or losing food assistance. So this could be a even greater hit to their ability to meet their basic needs.
Right. Yeah, I think you hit on something that is really important here, which is just the challenge associated with figuring out to whom these policies apply, the reporting burdens, and so on. But I want to turn it over to you, Nicole, and then we'll jump into some Q&A.
Yeah, sounds good. I'll make it real quick. So I think, it goes back to whether or not you're going to have to do this. And if it's optional, there are reasons why a housing authority might want to adopt this, adopt either work requirements or term limits. So I think if it's optional and you do choose to adopt them, I think it goes back to knowing what you want to achieve. So if you don't know your population and your barriers, it's going to be harder to set any kind of realistic, achievable goals. I think if you're trying to set time limits, you have to be realistic about what a time limit looks like. 2 years is unrealistic in any setting with any population. That's really that's rapid rehousing, not the same thing what we're trying to achieve here. So just some starting points, things like income levels, earned and assistance income, your education levels and digital literacy of your population. As Will mentioned, if you've got potential exemptions for households with young children, you want to know those types of things so that you can better design your program and identify how many households would likely be subject to your term limit and what are the outcomes and what are the potential outcomes that you might achieve, as well as whatever levels of support you can garner from your community partners as well, because I think those are going to be vital. So being realistic about both what you want to achieve and what you can achieve. I think having the data to help you establish those goals is key.
That is a great segue into a question we got from Amanda. She'd like to know, Nicole, if you all have studied the effectiveness specifically for the support services that you offer, and what you found to be most effective for these families who are under a time limit.
That's a great question, Amanda. So yes, we do actually, I can segue a little bit into also our work with, we have a long-term research partner, a university partner, Loma Linda University, we've been working with since the inception of our term limits activity. And they actually helped us design some studies. We actually use the self-sufficiency matrix. We're not the first to use it, but we adapted it to fit our specific program and implementation setup. And they do look at, again, all of those domains. So things like not just income, but also mental health and access to transportation and safety and housing stability and all of those kinds of things. And so they've helped us evaluate what has been effective and what hasn't. They have been able to identify through their evaluations that the positive outcomes that we've seen for our customers are not accidental, that they are related to the term limits initiative, not just kind of environmental factors, that these customers would have been achieving these successes even without the term limit. Now you've got me a little bit on the spot. I don't have the specific ones, but I can certainly do a follow-up and identify. I'll pull that report and find out what were the specific supports that they found that were the most effective. I'll get that for you, Amanda.
All right, and building on that as well, a question from Asif. For those who are reaching their time limits, are you able to track kind of how many people are able to stay in place versus move, if that mobility is linked to rent burdens? Yeah, anything you can share on that?
Yes, I can tell you this part is very tricky because once a customer leaves rental assistance, we no longer really have a relationship with them. And so getting information from them about what's happening post assistance is a voluntary process. And so we did set maybe an ambitious goal of applying a post assistance evaluation to customers leaving our program. We actually did apply and implement this from the first wave of customers leaving our program through graduation in 2017. And this was again done through our partnership with Loma Linda University. It is a voluntary survey, however, so customers are essentially self-selecting whether they want to participate in the survey. There is a small incentive for them to take the survey for their time. It follows the same domains as the self-sufficiency matrix that we use while they're in the program. And it asks questions just like that of, are you remaining in your unit? Are you continuing to be employed? So we can evaluate what are the changes post-assistance. So we do that measurement at exit, first and second year post-exit, that we ask customers to participate in that survey. So we do have some outcomes. Again, I apologize, I don't have them in front of me. I should have been more prepared and had that up in front of me, but I can do a follow-up and share with you. We do have some customers who have shared that they are back on waiting lists. That was by design. We don't have a lifetime time limit. Customers can come back and reapply for assistance if they need to in the future. We do have some customers who share that they reapply, but we also have many customers who have indicated that they've remained in their housing or moved to another housing unit. So I'll follow up with more details on that one.
That'd be terrific. Yeah, 45 minutes is also arguably too short to have this conversation. This question, I think, is for you, Will. Ron would like to know if there has been any talk of providing funding to assist households to gain employment or education, kind of in conjunction with these requirements.
No, there has not, and part of that is, in fairness, that there's almost no detail on these proposals. But the other thing, in fairness, is that the people who are proposing these proposals are also proposing to cut nearly every other program that provides assistance to low-income people, and that might be a source of federal funding for these supports. So I think the expectation that folks should have is that PHAs, and if they can get help from their state and local governments, but are likely to be mostly on their own and trying to figure out how to provide the support. So this isn't likely to come along with some new source of funding for that.
All right. We are definitely reaching the end here. Maybe time for one more short question. And I do want to circle back to your report, Will, since we have a minute. If you want to share any highlights, you all also developed state level estimates of who might be affected, which is really great. So I give you the floor for the next minute, if that's all right.
Sure, and I mean, and the data is very consistent with what what Ellie was talking about in her presentation. We're working with the same data, and they're finding similar things. But one thing I'd highlight, so the paper finds that it's about 3 million people that would be affected by a 2-year time limit on assistance. About half of those are children, and well over half are people who are working. So I think one key thing is that, and this is a proposal for a time limit, what was in the budget, a time limit without a work requirement. I think it's just kind of clear that even though this was framed as something that would support work, that this is not something that would actually do that it would be mostly taking away assistance from people who are already working but just aren't able to afford rent on their own. The other thing I just flag is that we have some more discussion on the study that you mentioned, the family option study, which compared ongoing voucher assistance to time limited assistance. And in that case, it was with an 18-month time limit for households with children that were experiencing homelessness at the start of the study. And that did find that like the time limited assistance and the ongoing assistance had pretty similar impacts at first. But then once the time limit kicked in and you looked at impacts after 3 years, that disappeared for the time limited assistance. So like the households with ongoing vouchers continued to have very sharp reductions in homelessness, but the time limited folks were pretty similar to the control group that didn't receive any assistance at all. So I think what this suggests is, at least for this population in this context, that that providing the time limited assistance didn't somehow stabilize them in a way that insulated them from homelessness going forward. Instead, when you implemented the time limited assistance, a lot of them found themselves unable to afford housing and then lost their homes.
Well, thank you both. This has been a really rich conversation, and thanks to Ellie as always. We will, of course, be posting a recording of this. We'll link to the slides so that you can go through them at your leisure. I also want to plug that we do facilitate a PHA community of practice where we dig into topics just like this one. We also love to work with housing authorities directly to help you think about how to use your data and how to use research to inform what you do. So I would be really excited to hear from you. If you are a PHA staffer and want to be part of any of that, reach out to me, please. But thanks again to our panelists, and see you next time.